who, as you'll know from her previous visits here, is a award-winning documentary maker and a science communicator. And that's something that we certainly need in these days. So over to you and welcome.
Sure, Margaret. And yeah, fáilte go díobh go léir. You kind of stole what I was going to say, which is that, you know, climate action is the most pressing long-term global challenge of our time. It's the first sentence of the National Hydrogen Strategy document. And we are all too aware, looking at the weather reports, of the consequences of climate change and the challenges and the complexities of decarbonising our society and economy. And as Alex said, the IIEA is all about sharing ideas and shaping policy. So today's discussion is about how to create a net zero gas network in Ireland in the next 20 years. It's no easy ask, but it's a challenge that must be met. And this event has been organised with the support of Gas Networks Ireland, and we're very pleased to be joined by a panel of experts who represent some of the various sectors who are going to have to come together to build this cleaner and more sustainable energy ecosystem in Ireland. So let me introduce them. Maybe reserve your rapturous applause until I've got through them all. We have Edwina Nyan, who's the Director of Strategy and Regulation at Gas Networks Ireland, Tom O'Brien, Group Chief Executive of Nefin Energy, Katie McNeil, Head of Scottish Government Office in Ireland, Charlie Brophy, Principal Officer, Electricity Storage and Hydrogen Policy in the Department of Climate, Energy and the Environment, and Barbara Jinks, Director of Ready for H2, joining us by Zoom. Hello, Barbara, how are you? And please, a very warm welcome to everybody. Our speakers are going to share some of their kind of initial thoughts and perspectives for a couple of minutes, 5 minutes or so, and then we'll go straight into a Q&A. And for those in the room, you can pose your questions in the traditional method of having a mic brought to you and raising your hand. And for those online, you can use the Zoom function, Q&A function. And please send in your questions throughout the session, and we'll come to them once our panelists have shared their initial thoughts and we've had a little bit of discussion. And if you are posing a question, please just state your name and your affiliation. And I really encourage you to actively participate in this conversation because, you know, it's invaluable to get everybody's perspectives and hear from people all over the country and people joining us online. And there's no such thing as a stupid question in my mind. So just a quick reminder that this event is being recorded. And if you want to start a discussion on Twitter, you can use the handle at IIEA. Now, our first speaker is Edwina Nyan, the Director of Strategy and Regulation at Gas Networks Ireland, a driving force behind the organisation's strategic direction, sustainability efforts and regulatory affairs, and brings deep industry knowledge and financial acumen to the table. She's a Fellow of Chartered Accountants Ireland and previously held senior finance roles in both Irvia and GNI. Edwina, do you want to share or set out your and GNI's vision for this hydrogen future?
Thanks, Katrina. I suppose, first of all, look, we're delighted in Gas Networks Ireland to sponsor today's event. Look, with the calibre of the panellists we have, I've no doubt we'll have a really good conversation. So, which I think, look, is fundamental actually to moving the decarbonisation of the gas network forward. I might start by setting out a document we published last year, which was our pathway to a net zero carbon network. And for us, it was actually quite a visionary document. It set out how we are going to decarbonise the gas network over the next 20 plus years. And look, I suppose it set out how we are going to move away from natural gas to renewable gases. And at the end of the pathway, we will have two networks, a biomethane network and a hydrogen network. So look, for us, it was really important to demonstrate our commitment to Ireland's climate targets and getting to net zero by 2050. I think, look, a vision is one thing, but like what I'd like to maybe chat about now is really to give you a sense of the work actually that's happening now in order to make that a reality. Biomethane is being injected into our network today, but it's in small quantities. But we have huge interest in developers actually connecting to the infrastructure. We did an expression of interest process about 2 years ago now, and we requested kind of information from developers who may be interested in injecting into the network. And we got 14.8 terawatt hours of potential interest, 176 respondents. And to give you a sense of scale, that's 2.5 times the current government target. But I suppose our challenge is now we have about 1% of that target on stream. And what we're seeing with developers, and Tom will give his perspective as well, is that it's challenging in order to go from interest to actually committing to a connection with us. And part of the challenge is revenue certainty. Like we've seen in the last, I suppose 12 months, 18 months, that people maybe are doing direct connections, but because they've maybe partnered with somebody else and done what we call a gas purchase agreement, so they have revenue certainty. And we are seeing about 0.5 terawatt actually materializing over the next 6 months that we'll have that operational, that capacity operational. But it's the challenge moving that on. And look, I think the RHO, which government is working on, but it's probably a little bit slower than we would have liked. And I know the minister has recently indicated that it'll probably be Q2 2026. And that does pose challenges for us in terms of actually getting to 5.7 terawatt hours by the end of this decade. Look, it also demonstrates though, like we've learnings from other countries, other organizations, if there's will, you can get delivery. And we can learn from other countries, but it's about turning that interest, as I said, into delivery. I think hydrogen for us is probably a longer term play. We see that probably coming into the network in about the mid-2030s in scale. In the first instance, we see it as blend, and that's basically blending it with natural gas. You also see it in the form of what we call clusters, which is basically where you have a dedicated hydrogen network, and over time that connects into the overall broader network. So look, infrastructure is a long-term game. While it may not be until 2030 that we see it coming into the network at scale, what we are doing right now is a lot of testing and trialing to understand how compatible our infrastructure is with hydrogen. And that's really important to us. We have an incredibly strong safety record. And this is a new gas, well, newish in that, right back when we did Towns gas a number of decades ago, 50% of that was hydrogen. So it's about how do we adapt our network. We've already done testing and trialing that says we can take blends of up to 20%. We're doing more work on that. And our customers, we've done work with customers as well. And the majority of them can take blends of 20% as well. So they're all encouraging signs. We're doing a lot of work as well with the likes of Amber, which is associated with Research Ireland on materials. We're also working with UCD, Energy Institute, around doing various studies, testing and trialing. We were chatting, myself and Kathy earlier on, we recently signed an MOU as well with National Gas, who have, moved further ahead than we have. And really that MOU is to make sure that we share kind of knowledge, experience, and learn from what they're doing in their project called Project Union. And they've tested an awful lot in one of their sites called Spade Adam, so where we can learn from that. We've also had an example of a customer that's been funded through our innovation fund, Dalton Chancery Mills. They're an Indigenous business in Ireland. They've been around for many generations and they malt barley. So they're a really, I suppose, progressive organisation that takes sustainability very seriously. So we've worked with them to introduce 20% hydrogen blend into their infrastructure, and it's worked. And they've been really complimentary of how it's helped them to decarbonise a hard-to-abate sector. So I suppose, yes, it's far away, but we need to be doing work now in order to progress that. Look, from our perspective, there's no doubt that there will be challenges in order to make this happen. But we are very clear that we're committed as an organisation in order to drive these projects. And look, traditionally we would have been associated with natural gas. We see ourselves on a transformational journey to get to 100% renewable target. Look, we're an infrastructure provider. We facilitate transportation. We can't develop biomethane facilities or hydrogen electrolyzers ourselves. But we really need to, I suppose, as a result, to work with the entire value chain, all of the people here today to make that happen. And look, unless we collectively work together, we're not actually going to achieve this at all. So that's just my initial perspective anyway.
Great, and I have so much to follow on up and after. And you say 2030 is when you're going to start seeing hydrogen coming on, and that's
mid-2030s.
Yeah. So it's not that far. So the work is well underway. Next up, we're going to hear from Tom O'Brien, Chief Executive of Neff Energy, Ireland's largest domestic producer of natural gas, with over 2 decades of experience spanning law, energy and investment, including leading roles in groundbreaking deals like the Corrib gas field acquisition. Tom brings deep expertise in the evolving energy landscape. So Tom, do you want to tell us a little bit about your perspective and the opportunities and the challenges that come with renewable gases?
So thank you everyone for having me here today. I guess if we're here to talk about transforming the gas network to net zero, there really is only one solution in the short to medium term for the foreseeable future in reality, and that's biomethane. The biomethane sector has huge potential in Ireland. The European Commission has come to the conclusion Ireland has the best agri-feedstock per capita in the whole of Europe. And so there's a huge opportunity there, not only to decarbonise the network, but to help Irish agriculture decarbonise and to help decarbonise industry. There's other associated benefits as well, of course, in terms of energy security, which is kind of close to my heart. As Edwina mentioned, the true capacity of Ireland is anywhere up to 14.8 terawatt hours per annum. And that represents about a third of Ireland's gas demand. And those sort of numbers are achievable with the right conditions. You only have to look at the country with the second best agri-feedstock per capita in the whole Europe, and that's Denmark. And Denmark are currently producing 40% of their gas supply from their own agri-resources, and they hope to reach 100% by 2030. So the potential is there, and that's why, notwithstanding our Cara business, and we do have a hydrogen project, early hydrogen project there, I set up Nefin Renewable Gas with a focus on biomethane, with the aim to become the largest biomethane producer in Ireland if we can. And I'm glad to report we'll be breaking ground this month in our first project in Ballinrobe, County Mayo. Notwithstanding that potential, we are seriously behind the rest of Europe. We took our first step last year with the publication of the National Biomethane Strategy, which set out a laudable set of targets and initiatives. Unfortunately, the majority of them remain unfulfilled in terms of any real progress over a year on. And that means that the industry has stalled somewhat. And the proof of that is the fact that the vast majority of the grants that were issued by the Department of Agriculture last year won't be utilised because developers are finding it difficult to get projects off the ground for a variety of reasons, some of which I'll touch on today. So I guess from my perspective, Ireland has a sort of stark choice, really. We are one of the most gas-dependent countries in Europe for our energy mix. We also happen to be one of the most insecure countries from an energy security perspective. So our choice is, do we continue, and like it or not, gas is a part of it's going to continue to be part of our future. We need the molecule, we need it for heat, we need it for industries. Electricity and storage is not the full solution, particularly when you look at our energy trajectory and you think about the future of AI and everything else. So what we need, the stark choice is, do we continue to rely on volatile global markets for a fossil fuel, or do we start to create the conditions so that we can invest in a homegrown circular energy economy that's rooted in rural Ireland? And I think I know what I prefer. To do that, though, we need a bit of coordinated action, some urgency. And that coordinated action needs to be across a few different areas: policy, infrastructure, finance, and market development. And I'm just going to touch on two of the ones that I think are has the most capacity for enabling growth, and they're in the areas of policy and infrastructure. Edwina mentioned the RHO. The renewable heat obligation is something that has, I mean, any sector like ours, nascent sector like ours, can't grow without demand, and you can't scale without certainty. And the renewable heat obligation was, as part of the National Biomethane Strategy, has been put forward as the single most important lever to help build long-term stable demand for biomethane. But it's long overdue. Now, for that RHO to work, it needs to do a couple of things. It needs to be ambitious and it needs to be effective. And to be effective, it needs to get two things, I think, particularly right. One is it needs to create a level playing field for domestically produced Irish biomethane, in the sense of creating a level playing field as it relates to foreign biomethane imports. Those imports may have been relying and benefiting from subsidies and state supports for many years. So that's the first thing. So what I'd say to government is, be brave, back rural Ireland, introduce, I think they're looking at a multiplier that would apply to Irish domestic production. So that has to be at the right level. And the second one in relation to the RHO is, obligants, I don't believe, should be allowed to apply to be able to satisfy their obligation through a disproportionate share of certain types of HVO fuels. So I think there's been a lot about this in the media recently. large volumes of Asian HVO have a sort of questionable sustainability and authenticity background. That product has damaged biomethane share of the renewable transport sector, for example. It's dropped by 60% since 2023. And many experts would agree that there's an issue there. So what I would say to government there is be careful how you get the balance right between the HVO and the biomethane. So biomethane doesn't suffer as a result of this HVO, which is over 90% of which is coming from Asia. There's more Malaysian used cooking oil in the Irish renewable heat sector, transport sector now than biomethane. Okay, that's the first one. The second thing is reverse compression. So reverse compression technology is required to unlock the capacity of rural Ireland's network. Very simply put, the National Biomethane Strategy says that the biomethane sector is to be agri-centric and located in rural Ireland to help farmers and decarbonise their own operations and decarbonise the network generally. And they also say in that strategy that larger plants are a bit better from an efficiency of scale perspective. Oh, and by the way, without biomethane, we don't reach our climate targets. So what does all this mean? It means we need an industry that's to be located in rural Ireland, beside where the feedstock is. But the unfortunate fact there is that most of rural Ireland is along the DX distribution network. It's not beside the high capacity transmission network. So that's the challenge. The good news is the solution is fairly straightforward. It's proven, tried and tested right across Europe. It's called reverse compression. For those of us who aren't of a technical bent, of which I definitely am one, essentially it's like a big old Dyson. It allows the biomethane
All
flow.
the engineers are whizzing at you.
It allows the biomethane flow uphill from the DX network up to the high capacity transmission network, right? And you could basically fit a unit in a glorified telephone booth, low single digit millions, but it locks hundreds of millions of investment. Our plant at Ballinrobe alone, over the life of that project, we estimate will be about over 200 million euro investment, over 100 million in feedstock alone over the life of that project. And that's just for one AD project. And what they do in Europe, if the French are building 30 of these over the next year or two, they're socializing the cost because the benefit is there for the whole gas network, for the climate agenda, for the rural economies. So that's it. That's my end of my dump.
Well, we might come back to some of that reverse compression and policy and infrastructure. And you might give us a better explanation than a Dyson.
Slightly different version.
We're going to move on to Katie McNeill, who is the current head of the Scottish Government Office in Ireland and promoting Scottish interests and strengthening the relationship with Ireland. Her previous roles in the Scottish Government include Programme Director of Connecting Scotland, CivTech Public Entrepreneur Lead, and Head of the Deputy First Minister's Private Office. You're so welcome, Katie. When we think of Scotland, we think of them as a renewable energy trailblazer in terms of offshore wind. Are you going to do the same with hydrogen?
Well, yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting me here today. And I guess we would say we would certainly hope to try to do that. For myself, I am definitely not a technical expert. I am very much of a policy background. So I've also spotted that there are some technical experts in the room. So everyone, please excuse me. I'll try not to use any Dyson related analogies yet.
It worked.
But yeah, I mean, Scotland's really ambitious about net zero and about renewable energy, and we have been for some time. Back around about 2005, we set a target to get 40% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2020. In 2011, a decision was made to up that to 100% of our own electricity needs. And at the time, people said that that was completely unachievable, that would be 10 years too early. Well, lo and behold, in 2020, I think we reached 98.8% and would now be more than 100% of our domestic electricity needs. But that said, that's not net zero. That's not all the energy that we need. So we are working towards reaching net zero by 2045. And that would be backed by what we're already seeing as consented for offshore wind. So we've got a reasonable amount of operational offshore wind, but we've got very much more that's out there, either in consenting and construction, all over the North Sea, heading up Orkney, Shetland, and now some of that consenting is moving across the top of Scotland towards the Outer Hebrides. And that, I think, Paddy, there's 40 gigawatts in development and consenting now. Yeah, 40 gigawatts. But that is also, we're going to need to use hydrogen as a way of using some of that electricity. So on hydrogen specifically, we have a target of reaching 5 gigawatts by 2030 and more, 25 by 2045. And remembering all these numbers. So yeah, these are big targets. This is a big ambition, but I think we've been conscious that government needs to work out what it needs to do in terms of creating the environment that's supportive to that. So we've kind of been on a journey with that, starting with a hydrogen assessment. I think took place during 2019 and was published in 2020. And then a sort of emerging hydrogen strategy, went on to a hydrogen action plan with some more concrete actions in 2022, and then a hydrogen export strategy in 2024, which actually starts to look at some of those things that you need around certainty of supply and certainty of demand that would help unlock the investment that we would need to get there. That's also been backed by, they're very hydrogen specific, but also working out the policy on what is our wider green industrial strategy, of which hydrogen would be one of those key opportunity areas for Scotland, where we can see that we have an advantage, and hydrogen and wind being the other one are potentially two things that we share very strongly with Ireland. So we're very keen to work together to share knowledge with our Irish government counterparts on that policy journey, but also what we can do to enable those other connections. We're working within a lot of this policy sits between what's for UK government and what's for Scottish government, and some of the infrastructure decisions are all at the UK level. So we're delighted by things like the MOU that Gas Networks Ireland have just signed with National Gas. So yeah, we are here to be ambitious about this. We've started to invest in a range of demonstrator projects across Scotland. There are some where there's domestic supply of hydrogen. We have a real cluster, regional cluster approach developing. And as you might imagine, Aberdeen's been a real centre for that. So now Aberdeen's city's bus fleet is all run using hydrogen buses. So do pay it a visit and take a trip on a hydrogen bus. But we're kind of seeing that as the way to go, with 2 green free ports in Forth, that's around Edinburgh and the Firth of Forth, and the other is in Cromarty and Inverness up in the Moray Firth. They will also become hydrogen clusters, but also spaces in which we hope Ireland can also learn from the new policy experiment that is the green free port model, and how that helps to really drive forward towards net zero.
Brilliant. Listen, I think there's going to be lots of questions for you about how all of that is achieved, how it has been achieved, and how it's going to be achieved. But we'll move on to Charlie. Charlie Brophy is Principal Officer for Electricity Storage and Hydrogen Policy, leads the charge, pardon the pun, on shaping Ireland's electricity storage framework and delivering the National Hydrogen Strategy, which are key pillars in transitioning to a renewable energy future. Charlie, do you want to kind of give us a snapshot of where we are from a policy point of view, what the milestones we've hit and where we're headed?
I suppose, like Scotland, we have set ourselves fairly tough targets to reach net zero by 2050 and to have our greenhouse gases by the end of this decade. And I suppose there's no one single way to reach that, but I think there's general agreement that it's going to take a combination of wind energy, solar energy, significant quantities of storage, whether it's something like Turlock Hill pumped hydro storage or battery storage like we've put in the last number of years, or maybe something like iron air and carbon batteries, which are coming, which are longer duration, up to 100 hours. We're also going to need some decarbonised gas, which we can store and use for those longer periods when the wind isn't blowing, sun isn't shining for a number of days, and hydrogen is going to fit in into that sector. We'll also probably need to build a few more electric interconnectors, and biomethane obviously also has a role to play in that. But I think while it is going to be expensive to move there, I think we should also be looking at the opportunities that this is presenting us. And as been alluded to earlier, Ireland's energy security is not in a great position. For the past number of years, we've been importing up to about 80% of our energy, whether it's gas or oil or whatever source. I suppose when the Corrib gas field came online 8 or 10 years ago, we were probably down to about 65% of the energy that we were importing every year. So as we bring more renewables online, and if we produce hydrogen, we can generate the hydrogen and we can store it and keep it for long-term storage. And along with the other storage and batteries, pumped hydro, we can use that so as we have a more secure energy supply. I suppose there are other areas where we can benefit from it as well. And I think when we look at the sea area around Ireland, it's 7 times our land mass. And there's huge potential out there to generate wind power, and from that wind energy to convert it into hydrogen. I suppose we see some movement certainly along the East Coast, where we have a number of developers currently in planning for wind power, and that is good to see. I think, unfortunately, we're still a little bit away from when we can put floating wind out in the Atlantic coast before that will be commercially available. But we have to look down in that direction and start preparing for it now. So we have huge possibilities that we can produce far more hydrogen than we're going to need domestically. And we can look at to develop industry around that. We have there's sustainable aviation fuel, marine fuel, ammonia fertilizer. So there are just some of the opportunities which are out there. I suppose when we think back maybe 30, 40 years ago, we didn't have a pharmaceutical industry in Ireland. We didn't have a large IT sector in Ireland. Both those areas are producing plenty of well-paid, highly skilled jobs and contributing significantly to the economy. And over the next decade or two, hopefully hydrogen will be in a similar position to that. And we've also been, or has been mentioned earlier, about exporting hydrogen as well. I suppose in Northwest Europe, there is already relatively large quantities of hydrogen being used, grey hydrogen in general. But those people that want to switch over to green hydrogen, and there's going to be additional industries looking for hydrogen. Germany, for example, has already indicated that they expect to be importing 50 to 70% of their hydrogen demand, green hydrogen demand, in 2040. And I think Ireland could be seized on that opportunity. There'll be plenty of other countries, including our colleagues and friends in Scotland, who will also see it as an opportunity. But even right around the world, I know the Germans have been talking to people in Australia and Chile and Namibia, in I think up to about 40 countries around the world. And we have been talking to them as well about the opportunities which are there. So I think that while there is maybe a cost, but people generally see the cost to it, but we also have to look at the opportunities which are there. And I think if we look at how we're going to reach there, and sometimes we're said that we're a little bit slow moving along, but I suppose in the last couple of years, in 2023, we brought out the first national hydrogen strategy. And within that strategy, there were 21 actions, which are the multi-year actions, which would help to get the hydrogen sector up and running. And there was also an action within the 2024 Climate Action Plan to bring an overall structure to those actions in order to move them forward. So just last week, the Minister approved the National Hydrogen Programme Task Force, and that'll be a high-level task force. It'll be chaired by an Assistant Secretary within our department. And we'll have senior people from other government departments and from industry, from GNI, from Crew, from Airgrid, from MARA, from NSAI, and they will help to drive the hydrogen sector forward. They'll be in a position where, when coming together, we'll be able to have a look at what are things which are slowing this down, what needs to be done across government to help to move it along. And I suppose there will be 3 main areas they'll be looking at. They'll be looking at safety and regulation, and I had to write these down because I generally forget them: infrastructure and systems, and markets and commercialization. So there are sort of the three pillars which we will look at, and each of the 21 actions within the strategy will be provided to working groups under each of those three areas in order to move the sector forward. So I think it's a big milestone to have got this task force up and running. It has to be noted by government, and hopefully we'll be having the first meeting of it early in the autumn. So I think that'll be a help to move forward.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
And I think those task forces, is there one for offshore wind as well? About
One for accelerating offshore renewables.
Ireland is a nice small country where actually you can kind of get things done if you know who the right person is to call. Okay, great. I think there's probably a good few things that you mentioned there that we'll pick up on later, but Barbara Jinks, who's been patiently waiting for us on Zoom. She's the director of the Ready for H2 project, which brings together over 60 gas operators across 10 European countries to chart the role of hydrogen in decarbonising our energy systems. And she's got more than 35 years of experience in the gas industry, spanning everything from greenfield projects to global energy policy. So Barbara, you're very welcome. Do you want to share some of your thoughts after listening to our speakers there about how we can get hydrogen ready?
Yeah, thank you, Katrina, and a huge thanks to Liam Nolan and Edwina for inviting me to speak on this topic. And we're in discussion with GNI to join our project, which is great. So, I mean, Charlie, actually, was a perfect segue. I think the last thing you mentioned was infrastructure, or it was market, but the second last, because what we do was about 5 years ago, there was a recognition between the gas distribution operators across Europe, across many countries, that actually there was a lot of momentum and activity and efforts going into the transmission grid and importing, the production of hydrogen, the importing and the transmission. But there wasn't much happening on storage and distribution. So that's why this large group of distribution system operators got together and said, actually, we need to understand what our role is in the energy transition and raise the profile. And what are we asking for? What do we need? We want to be part of the solution. So it's inward looking and it's outward looking. We've done research, which I'll give you an overview of, about how the DSOs, the distribution system operators, are converting, getting ready for when hydrogen is ready. There is no hydrogen at the moment. That is one of the huge challenges, the supply and demand. But the DSOs want to be ready when hydrogen comes. Their systems are ready to deliver hydrogen. So it's across 10 countries, as you say. It's a formidable group because it's a 1.6 million kilometers out of the 2.2 in Europe. Sorry,
I interrupt you, Barbara. We just lost you there for a second.
Okay. 90 million customers, 1.6 million kilometers of distribution pipes is what the project represents. Interestingly, in Europe, distribution pipes, there's 10 times the kilometers of distribution pipes as there are transmission. And I think 99% of the effort is on the European hydrogen backbone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, there's just a little bit of delay sometimes, so just keep going.
Yeah, I can see you guys freeze, so I'll kind of try and adapt. And the distribution grids, there's 3 times the investment has been spent in the distribution grid compared to transmission. So we really focus on that. 99% of gas consumers in Europe are delivered their gas through a distribution grid. So you can see, and same in Ireland, that the gas distribution grid connects everyone. And what an opportunity to deliver not only natural gas to replace heavier emitting fuels, but biomethane, absolutely #1 priority. But in areas where you don't have the prospect for biomethane, you have the option to put hydrogen down those pipes. And that's what we look at. So I've got a slide to share, which I nearly forgot to pop up. Just let me know when you can see it. Yeah.
Not yet. Oh, there we go.
Okay. So I thought it was very useful to have a slide. Sorry, I need to make it large for you. So can you see the slide? Yeah.
Yeah, if you could make it large for us, it would be helpful.
Yeah, I have. I think there's a delay.
Beautiful.
Thanks. So what we did was we mapped where is the delivery of hydrogen. You can see the map on the top right has got lots of lines. That's the European hydrogen backbone. And in Germany, it's the Kernnetz. And we mapped this before Spain then announced theirs. You can see that it's overall But the areas in the different shades of blue are the demand for hydrogen that is more than 3 kilometers from any transition pipe. And you would not connect them with a transmission pipe. The DSOs would connect those areas. That is snapshotted in the pie chart in the middle, where over 50% of all hydrogen demand in large industry, small industry, transportation, and buildings and heating, over half have to be delivered through a distribution pipe. 11% of the demand is within 1 to 3%. So some of that will be transmission pipes, some will be the distribution grid, and nearly 40% is within a kilometre. And again, it's a case-by-case basis of whether you would connect that by the transmission operator or distribution. So you can see that the role of the distribution and grids in delivering hydrogen, if they're not ready, the majority of your hydrogen will not get to the end user, and that's the key message. The other key messages are that that is the hydrogen demand in 2050 on the map. And you can see that Germany is one of the largest consumers, but also Slovakia and Czech Republic really need hydrogen, mostly for building and heatings by that time. And Spain has a lot of, surprised us by having a lot of demand. So the other key point is if you deliver any gas to a building, it has to be through a distribution pipe because it's smaller, lower pressures and smaller quantities. But industry, 71% needs to be connected by distribution pipe and 30% of your transport. So in other words, distribution pipes are super important to delivering green energy. This also gives us, as Charlie was saying and Tom was saying, that the opportunities to have flexibility in a gas pipeline. You can have natural gas, you can have biomethane, you can have hydrogen. They can be mixed and they can come from wherever they come from. It doesn't matter. So it gives you flexibility in your energy supply and to ramp up your domestic production and ramp down exports. It also allows a faster transition. You can repurpose a pipe within months, a pipeline, rather than build a new pipeline, which can take years with approvals. And for distribution pipes, that's even easier. And in particular, in regional areas where you can make green gases, so you can produce your own biomethane or make green hydrogen with local solar or wind, you can then distribute that in large areas without the need for waiting for any backbone or any major infrastructure. So it allows you faster development. So we can touch on some of these, and maybe I'll finish up by saying that there were lots of projects. We've got over 58 projects underway just in our membership, which show that the technology is not a barrier. All the technical issues can be solved. What the biggest issues are, of course, is where's the hydrogen coming from and what's the demand? Customers are often, I think Tom mentioned, is customers are often just unaware of the value proposition. They just don't understand hydrogen. They don't know that it's an option. And also lack of understanding of the benefits. Even if you only have 20% blend, as I think Edwina mentioned, you still get 8% emission reductions, greenhouse gas emission reductions, and 8% is considerable. So I'll stop there and maybe share some of what the DSOs are asking for from policymakers later in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. And thank you for persevering with the intermittent signal. I mean, I think that kind of very much sets the scene for us, doesn't it? I mean, there's everything from infrastructure to policy, financing, market, everything. But Andrea, I might come to you first. None of this happens unless the RHO happens. Is that true? Is that the fast tracking of that essential?
Look, I think from a biomethane perspective, policy is key. Look, there are other routes to market, but to some extent, they've been tapped already. The other area potentially, and it'd be interesting to get Tom's view on this, like large energy users are very often crying out for kind of, renewable gas requirements. So are you doing some policy work on that at the moment? And I think if we had more planning, potentially requirements around renewable gases, that could be another route to market. But the RHO is critically important, 100%. And look, Tom touched on it as well, and we would agree, like what we're seeing from a developer's perspective is, you've some developers who have a lot of equity backing, but they're competing for capital across multiple jurisdictions. So like if they can't give certainty in relation to revenue, why would you invest in a project? Like these are commercial entities, you know, so like the RHO gives you a level of certainty, and for us that's really important. But as I said, Ellie, could be another route.
And I mean, that Chancellor Mills example of how they decarbonise, was that just a kind of a bespoke pilot that you went? These are a good example of a
and look, I suppose they're a great example because they're, you know, a large business, but at the same time they don't have the knowledge and expertise maybe as some of your pharma or other multinationals, you know. So like, but they're really progressive in terms of their sustainability agenda. And we were able to work with them through some of the innovation funding that we have available. And we made the solution work for them then as a result. And I think, you know, if you look at test cases like that, they're really important. But would it have been as easy for Dalton Chardsley Mills to do it on their own? No, because hydrogen is 3 times more expensive. Well, green hydrogen will be 3 times more expensive. So like there is the cost as well associated with it. So look, it was a really good, important story. We learned a lot from it. I think they really appreciated, you know, the value that they got from it as well.
Yeah. And Tom, that kind of, I suppose the fact that Ireland has got one of the lowest shares of renewable heat in our system, like how do we catch up? What do you see as our way of catching up?
I was going to, repeating myself, I suppose it is getting a viable biomethane industry up and running. Edwina is right, I think, around the LEUs. I think there was a lot of uncertainty around large energy user connection policy for a long time. Under the previous administration, it was sort of there was some doubt being thrown at it. So folks, one thing companies don't like is uncertainty. They need certainty. They're starting to get some of that now with the CRU announcement some months ago, but that needs to be fleshed out some more. So I think it's introducing the right policies. It is putting in place, mandating GNI to roll out a reverse compression program. So they have a set of guidelines that they can adopt, like they have when it comes to grid connection. Something similar for reverse compression would be helpful too. I think it's, you know, a dozen more of these units, give or take 10 to 20, could actually unblock the bulk of the constraints across the rural network. So it's those sort of practical things. I would say this actually, and this is no criticism of the National Biomethane Strategy set up a similar task force implementation group. And they really only have met over the course of the last year, probably less than the fingers in one hand. That's not good enough. So there needs to be, when I talk about a sense of urgency, we need a sense of urgency because everything that we're trying to do will naturally, of its own nature, take time. Planning takes time. You know, gathering all the permits for these projects take time. So I think we do need to inject a little bit of urgency into this. I mean, just one last point on energy security. I used to write about this before I dropped my pen and got whatever, but there was an interesting report published by SEPA in May, which funnily enough wasn't picked up at all really by the media. If you remember, SEPA did the original energy security review for Minister Ryan, and they put forward this idea that we could build this national FSRU, which I think GNI have been tasked with, and somehow that would be our sort of solution for our energy security issues while we wait for the manna from heaven that is offshore wind. SEPA gave out a report published a report on the 16th of May, coincidentally, you know, under the new administration, but they admit that even with the FSRU, we have serious energy security issues if, for example, one of the interconnectors with the UK gas connectors was to go down. So there's a very real issue there, and we all know it. So I would say, like I said in my opening remarks, there are things we can do that are immediate with tried and tested technology, like biomethane. There's thousands of these plants across Europe. Hydrogen is maybe another generation away slightly. So let's go after it. Let's move from being a laggard in renewable gas to a leader because we have the raw materials to do it.
And Charlie, might let you come back in there. Is there sufficient sense of urgency to kind of get this up and running?
There is, and I suppose sometimes when you look at something like the task force and you say it only met 4 or 5 times a year, I think most of the task forces which are there at the moment, there is that high level body which maybe meets 4 or 5 times a year. But underneath that, there's probably up to 6, 8, 10 working groups which are meeting on a much more regular basis, every 2 to 3 weeks. And that's where a lot of the groundwork is being done. And I suppose it's really the issues which maybe aren't resolved as easily in those working groups that has pushed up to higher up. So I think it's difficult. There are a lot of competing things competing for everybody's time, and certainly at senior level. And I think that when they do get together and you bring people from different government partners together in the task force, in the meeting, there can be a lot of work achieved there. But sometimes it's probably optically it may not look quite as if there is as much work doing. But I think one of the reasons why we were keen to get a task force set up on the hydrogen side is because getting that high level buy-in from different government departments and different agencies, it certainly helps to remove some of those blockages and move things along.
I liked when you were talking to Katie earlier, you called her your colleague and friend, but you didn't say competitor, because I think if you're looking at Scotland, if we're too slow and Scotland zoom ahead as they have done with offshore wind, are we going to miss the hydrogen boat? And actually they're going to have all the hydrogen in this grid and they're going to be dispersing it through Barbara all across Europe, and actually we'll be left behind. Do you think, Katie, are you somebody who kind of are looking at Ireland going, actually take your time doing that now and we'll just go ahead and we'll progress, no problem?
I suppose at a strategic level, the existing gas network links Scotland and Ireland, and I mean, that's one of the ways where we see that we have a real shared interest here. And I guess if you're talking about there's a point at which export starts, maybe that does start to flow the other way. I don't think that we would look at Ireland as a competitor as such. I mean, I suppose the issue that we'll all face as we develop these industries is constraints on the actual supply of skilled workers and the materials and the electrolyzers, if that's what you're looking at, is how can you get what you need in order to create it, rather than will there be a market for the end product? Because I think what you're saying about, you know, the needs Germany, for example, has already put out there would mean that, you know, we're not going to be competing for who's going to buy the end product.
Yeah, but we might be competing for talent and materials.
Or you might benefit from the development of talent and the supply chain in Scotland that then enables you to move faster than you might have otherwise been able to do and continue the trade that exists between our two countries.
And just adding to that, like, there's a lot of cooperation already. For example, within the department, I think they recognise maybe the need to bring in some expertise in hydrogen. We have a colleague in from GNI, and we've also a colleague in from DESNZ in the UK, who have brought a lot of experience on the hydrogen. Just later on this month, the UK and Irish governments are meeting, and there's also going to be we're also meeting our colleagues on the hydrogen sector, where knowledge sharing event. So we don't see the UK or the Scottish as our competitors in this. We're working with them. And I suppose if further down the road and we want to export hydrogen to Northeast or Northwestern Europe, it's likely we will join in with some pipeline which is going either the Scottish one or some from somewhere in the UK. So I think there's a lot to be learned, and I think that it's more cooperation rather than competition at this stage, anyway, and for the next while. I think there is a very large market out there which can be tapped in, and I certainly think it's cooperation at this stage.
Very diplomatic answer, well done. Barbara, I'm going to come to you. Do you have any kind of lessons from high performers around Europe that we can, learn from, so that we can expedite the process and get on this hydrogen or biomethane journey quicker?
Well, definitely in terms of ambition, I think Scotland's up there. In terms of spending money and building new infrastructure for hydrogen, Germany, I think, is absolutely the leader. I mean, I'm based in Bonn, so I see all around me. They're actually the first transmission pipeline is being filled with hydrogen right now from the north. There is a new project being developed to bring in offshore hydrogen, actually from the German North Sea. They have a bit that sticks out from the northwest of Germany into the North Sea. They put the approvals in, they just got them, and Gascade is planning a pipeline to bring hydrogen in. 100 pilot projects, maybe. They're the largest member of our group. And a lot of all the projects have been successful. And interesting things like, if for biomethane, there's no cost to change the distribution grid. It's a drop in fuel. But if you wanted to convert with a distribution pipe, it's only 7% the cost of a new build to repurpose a pipeline. And the largest piece of the largest station in the system is a gas pressure reduction and metering station, and that's half the cost from a new build. So the leaders are showing us what's possible. And I think Germany's putting money where its mouth is at the moment. Of course, they suck 25% of all the energy in Europe they consume. They have to be the front runners, or they're just going to be so stuck or reliant on undesirable imports that forever. Yeah.
Well, actually, on that point, we might go to one of our questions from Christian Resch from the German Embassy in Dublin, who's apologising for not joining us. Thank you for joining us online, not in person. Who's asking which steps need to be taken to bring potential off-takers and future providers together? What are the biggest challenges in this project? And he's mentioning the bilateral German-Irish Higher Land project, which looks at engineering and commercial issues and will deliver first results by the end of the year. So what are the biggest challenges to bring the potential off-takers and future providers together? Is that something, Edwina, you'd like to talk about?
In terms of what we've seen, and maybe I'll use biomethane probably as an example, we recently set up a customer solutions team in Gas Networks Ireland to talk to some of the larger customers that consume gas, and actually sometimes they didn't even know biomethane was available. And what we've looked at is there ways that we can, identify if they need to work with the developer, can we help to bridge some of that? So I think sometimes some of the customers don't even know what's possible. I think with hydrogen it's a slightly different challenge in that, like, we don't have an existing market for hydrogen other than Irving Oil, which consumes hydrogen in Ireland. So again, it's about bringing them on a journey, and it's about getting them to a position that, if they have investment that they need to make in their infrastructure, that they're supported to do that. So look, I think it's about, parties like us trying to help them to bring them together. It's probably us as an organisation, I suppose, talking about things like biomethane and hydrogen and the possibility of it as well.
And Katie, is there any experience from Scotland of those kind of situations, or is there any kind of, interesting organisation that does that, or was your transition very much just oil and gas? It makes perfect sense for us to go to wind, which makes perfect sense to go to hydrogen.
Yeah, so I think on the matching supply and demand, that's been part of the idea of having these hub areas, for example, in Aberdeen. I mean, of course, there is this real need for us to think strategically about the fact that oil and gas has supported a lot of our economy, and there's a big effort going into what we call the just transition. So quite a lot of funds available there along the north and northeast in particular, to look at how you do transition from oil and gas, both in terms of infrastructure, but then also jobs and skills, and what it means for those communities, some of whom will have seen changes from fishing to oil and gas and now to renewables. So I think it's a mix of things, but the hubs is definitely how we've been addressing at this stage with the scale of the industry, that matching producers and off-takers.
And do you want to just tell us a little story about where you come from?
Oh,
it's
yeah,
quite interesting in terms of just the transition over the decades.
Yeah, so transition over the decades. So I'm actually from the Murray Firth area. So I grew up close to Inverness, and I would have seen when I was at school that many of my friends' fathers would have worked at the Ardseer oil fabrication yard. At its height, it employed more than 4,000 people. The population of the town I lived in at the time was only, I think, about 7,000 folks. So you can see that was a really big industry. They were the largest private employer in Scotland. But over time, that fabrication yard, there was a lack of demand, and by 2001 it had shut down completely. Now it has received some really big investments from the Scottish National Investment Bank, and the UK, what was the UK Infrastructure Bank, but now has a new name, the Wealth Fund, UK Wealth Fund, along with they've given 100 million of a debt finance to redevelop it, along with about 300 million of investment coming from the private sector. And that now is going to be an absolutely massive marshalling yard. They started dredging today, as Barry earlier this week, as Barry discovered. There's going to be 650 metres of quay wall, deep port, and it's also part of a wider 450-acre site that will be within the Green Freeport. So there's real opportunities for other businesses to come into Ardersier again, and who knows, it may well surpass its previous records of 4,500 employees.
Yeah, amazing. There's like a good few questions coming in, and I think I might kind of roll them in together, which is, one of them is saying about, for Indigenous biomethane, there's no established price information. This is coming from Shona Madden, Energy Lead at Johnson & Johnson. There's no established price formation yet, as the market is still in its infancy and is not developed due to delays in the RHO, which we've kind of covered on already. But then Joseph Cummins, Principal Officer of Climate Action and Energy Policy Unit in the Department of Enterprise, Tourism and Employment, is saying that because the future is mostly electric, decarbonised gas will be required primarily for high temperature heat in specific manufacturing sectors and long duration energy storage, but is unlikely to be the lowest cost solution for space or water heating. So does this imply a much smaller gas grid with fewer customers? And should we be depreciating gas infrastructure assets quicker to avoid stranded assets and high costs for those applications that will need the gas?
That's definitely one for me anyway.
I can take the first one on the price. I mean,
yeah.
National Biomethane Strategy did try to give some guidance on the cost of production and the range of cost of production for different size plants. So the information is there. All you've got to figure out then is what margin do you think the developer will need to make a return on his investment. So there is information out there of range bound where biomethane it will go for, just to say that.
I think on the smaller gas grid, just to give you a sense of scale, like we've about 720,000 customers, and a lot of those are domestic customers. But actually, when you look at our usage, they're 11% of our demand. So a huge part of our demand is actually the electricity sector. And Joe is right, like the high temperature heat is obviously one that can't be electrified as well. And I think we do see, when we looked at our pathway last year, the amount of gas that's actually flowing through our pipes will reduce. But what we are seeing is our peak, which is basically when there is no wind, when there is no solar available, that the gas network has to ramp up in order to meet that electricity demand. So like we do see the role of our network actually changing. We do see customer losses, but if you look at the volume of flows, we'll still have about 89% of our volume going through the infrastructure. And look, in terms of accelerated depreciation, the Ofgem yesterday published RIIO-3, which is kind of the equivalent of our price control here in Ireland, and they are looking at accelerated depreciation on new assets in the distribution business. So look, I think we would definitely have to look at that, but I think you also have to look at that in the context of how will that infrastructure be repurposed, back to what Barbara was talking about. So it is going to be something we need to consider. But like, to give you a sense of scale as well, like while we are seeing customers move away from gas, our top level customer numbers are still kind of around the same. And what we're seeing in other jurisdictions as well is, where there is restraints on or constraints on the electricity grid, they are using gas as a peaker. So we have seen things like hybrid heat pumps being rolled out, which again, you're using less gas, but then when it's needed, when electricity capacity isn't available, the gas network is providing that resource. So the role of our network is definitely changing. We will lose some customers, but I suppose we still have very large customers on the network that still need gas. And back to Charlie's point earlier on, we don't know if there's going to be new customer groups that come on into the mix, whether that's freight, whether it's sustainable aviation fluid and fuel. I suppose the other thing as well is, like we were talking about the ability to export. And look, electricity interconnectors will give you some ability to export electricity, but the gas network is far bigger and has greater capacity. And we're working, I think Barbara mentioned it as well, in the European backbone, which is basically looking at 5 corridors across Europe and a way of transporting gas, you know, through Scotland and into, you know, the likes of Germany, into the other parts of Europe. So actually working with our Scottish counterparts, national gas, is really critical if we actually want to export in the future. So look, I think from our perspective, that's definitely something we need to consider. And we're very conscious of that from a customer perspective, but we also need to look at the opportunities and the repurposing as well, because we don't want to overburden customers right now and say, well, we'll accelerate our depreciation rates, but actually we're going to repurpose them to hydrogen in the future.
Katrina, can I add to that?
You, Barbara, yes.
In terms of the smaller grids, the majority of gas is, you know, delivered through the smaller distribution grids, and the demand is just going up steadily because of population and increasing energy demand. And I'm just looking at our report, even for electricity, and in our study for electricity and the production of e-fuels, there is a demand only in the 9 countries in the study for 350 terawatt hours. So we'll never have enough hydrogen, really, you know. And also Germany, there's various studies on the DVGW website, the German Gas Association, that shows that they need renewable gases, in particular hydrogen, for power. So it's not just replacing, you know, the gas customers, just to answer that. It's still a growing market.
I think that's the point. There's been a tendency in Irish energy policy debate to sort of exclude that. We'll only have this, thank you very much.
Yeah.
You're a smaller country, too far the edge of Europe, and too energy insecure to be that picky and choosy. We need it all. No one person, you know, can play a symphony. You need the whole orchestra. We need the wind section. You need, you know, the bass trombones, wherever they are, fossil fuel for a time at least. We're going to need it all. So the idea of, you know, GNI operate in an international context, a first-class modern gas network, €3 billion worth of kit. The idea that we can sort of have the luxury of winding it down prematurely is not realistic. You know, an offshore wind takes time. I was a snot-nosed junior lawyer once. I worked on Arctobanks 1, and that was 25 years ago. There hasn't been a second offshore wind farm in Ireland. So it's going to take time. So in the meantime, we're going to need all these levers. We need to be able to pull on all of them.
I think the other important point as well is that if you look at our rail network, we decommissioned parts of our rail network and we're now investing in it. And look, you know, we've €3 billion of asset in the ground. If you had to actually build that today, it would be multiples of it. And Barbara mentioned like 9% for the distribution. Like the regulators in Europe estimate that to repurpose a gas pipeline is somewhere between 10 and 35%, notwithstanding the challenges we have in relation to delivering infrastructure in the country. So like, I think we do need to be very careful that we don't actually say we will shut down or decommission a piece of infrastructure when it could be repurposed, and that we regret that decision in the future because we will pay multiples of that in order to reconstruct.
And Nola Regan is asking, does our high energy prices limit our potential to export?
Great question, Noel. Look, I think right now, like hydrogen is expensive, right? And it's probably 3, maybe 4 times the cost of natural gas. I think over time, if you got to a position that you reduce the cost of hydrogen, reduce the cost of biomethane, which we've seen in other jurisdictions, I think that will help. Look, it is hard at the moment in terms of some of the electricity prices that we're importing because we're higher than other markets. But I think if we can move the industry and take the learnings from other jurisdictions, then we can benefit. Yeah.
We're only going to be in a position to export when we've hit a critical mass where we have surplus energy. So energy prices at that point will have to be lower than they are now. But it is a long way away.
Yeah, we import 85% of our energy.
Yeah, and we're a price taker. So
I think over time, and there has been some work done this in the department. AFRI did a report where they looked at that Ireland, we mightn't be the most competitive for hydrogen down the road, but we would be within that ball range. And I think particularly since Russia invaded Ukraine, I think European countries are much more conscious about having security of supply. So even if we were slightly more expensive, we may still be able to, we'll still be an attractive proposition, secure supply,
As a trusted partner.
trusted partner, yeah.
Actually, Katrina, can I just absolutely add sorry.
Yeah, and I'm going to go to the floor and take some questions.
Yeah, because it's like, what is the value? What is the cost of something? How much do you need it? If you don't have an alternative and you have the commitment to decarbonize, is it too expensive? Do you shut down your business? Or also with carbon pricing and with hidden subsidies all over the place with fossil fuels, is hydrogen really more expensive when all on a level playing field? And solar came down 83%, I think. Hydrogen can come down. So it's such a complex issue. If you look at the supply chain intermittency, I think in Germany, we poor energy consumers, in the congestion costs, it's billions of euros per year in electricity congestion. No one talks about that. So hydrogen would, as a storage medium, would certainly reduce that. So cost is a very complicated thing, and we shouldn't talk about the cost of hydrogen at the electrolyzer, because that's not part of the whole supply chain.
And how much is the cost of a livable future?
Exactly.
And look, I think also right now, like we've seen constrained and curtailment in the wind industry. So like if we don't convert that excess wind into hydrogen, what's that going to cost? Like we're already paying billions, or will pay billions in the future.
Yeah.
So like we need to harness that. And like I think, look, if you look at our offshore wind targets, we're talking about 36 gigawatts. Like the electricity forecasts are going up to 16. So like I think we're all saying we need to address the Irish market first. We've challenges to get there first and then export in the future. But there's definitely a demand for it.
Yeah.
And I think just on the export, I think if you go back to the first questioner, Christian, from the German embassy, we have a declaration of interest with the Germans to share knowledge on hydrogen. And the project which you was talking about, the Ireland project, the German government are actually funding that in conjunction with ESB and ourselves. And they're looking at the possibility of generating hydrogen here and then how you would transport it. And they're looking at initially shipping it there and looking at the cost there. And they're also, it'll be interesting when their study is completed later in the year, because they have looked at the cost of hydrogen in a number of regions, and they will be able to give us a sort of benchmark as to whether we're within a ballpark of being competitive on that or not. But the Germans are very keen at this stage.
And sorry,
Barbara, I'm just conscious that I have people on the floor here
okay,
with their hands raised, so I'm going to take a few questions and then I'll come back to you if you hold that
okay.
thought.
Yeah.
Thanks to the panel. Dan O'Brien, economist here at the Institute. Question and a point. Question to the panel. LNG, the importation of, what do you think of it from both a price, or all three, price, sustainability and security supply perspective? And just a point, security supply has been mentioned. I think Charlie was the first person to mention Russia during the whole course of the discussion. I think it's necessary to just talk about security supply, but just how radically changed the security environment in Europe has been over the past 3 years. Nearly every one of our partners in this on the continent over the past week has committed to increase defence spending to 5% of GDP. That is a massive change. And it's not clear to me that this is always appreciated in this country, just the extent how the environment has changed, and that if it does change in the worst, it will affect us.
I might start with that. I'm sure others will come in as well. Look, 80% of the gas that we use in this country is imported. And it's imported through 2 interconnectors that run from southwest Scotland actually into Dublin. 2 or 3 years ago, pre the Russian-Ukraine crisis, we would have said, we've never had an issue, they're perfectly safe. That has very much changed. You've seen the incidents even with Nord Stream, the Baltics. I think it's become much more of a reality. Government tasked us with looking at a strategic gas emergency reserve, and basically what that is designed to do is to be there in hopefully the unlikely event that we have a rupture on the interconnectors. So for me, I think it's really important. It's only when you look at how the role that gas plays in terms of generating electricity and how it's used across the industry, like if we did have a rupture, it would have a fairly significant impact on Irish society, and like probably take us about 6 months to repair that. So like I think in the Energy Security Review, government are recognising the criticality of security of supply. In other jurisdictions, they have multiple sources of gas. They have gas storage. we don't have those in Ireland. So like it's a really important kind of transitional arrangement until we get to renewable gases. I think in terms of price, look, we operate in a world gas market, and what we pay today is, you know, the same whether it's coming through LNG or whether it's coming through the interconnector system. And I think, look, in terms of sustainability, like the preference from the government's perspective is it would only be used in an emergency. So our gas would continue to come through the kind of the Irish system. And look, I think we have that kind of challenge all the time around the kind of the energy trilemma around net zero, security of supply and cost. And we have to have the right balance, to be fair, Dan.
So it's a break in case of an emergency situation. And hopefully we wouldn't have to use it, but to not have it would be reckless. Yeah. Does anyone else want to talk about LNG?
Yeah, I'll talk about it. It's going to cost the Exchequer through probably PSO or different sort of levies. It's about, I think they said 900 million was the last number, but the truth is, we all know from an Irish experience that's going to be well in excess of that number. We all know about Shannon LNG. There was a company who is specialist LNG developer, who've been trying to build an LNG facility there for many, many years. And they've been frustrated not only they were frustrated by the political system.
By opposition.
And by opposition, but you know, they're particularly, you know, the previous minister did intervene and write to the board, which is a you know, a very unusual step in many respects. But then there was a pivot to sort of, well, actually we do need an LNG facility, but just not a private sector one. We'll build our own. So that has a price associated with it, right, on the consumer. So from a security supply perspective, I mean, there was a cross-departmental study then Christmas last year. I think they called it Project Cahill, where they looked at what would happen if one of these interconnectors went down, and it's some stark figures, yeah. And on its own, the FSRU will help, but it's not a solution. Again, I refer to the report that was published. Now, I would say this, wouldn't I? But one of the things I think we should explore, I mean, New Zealand banned the granting of new gas licenses. And I'm not standing here for a moment saying, let's open up offshore Ireland to gas exploration again. Not at all. But there is €3.5 billion worth of kit at Corrib. And I know I have a vested interest in this, right? But it's a world-class asset that's, you know, 98% uptime and availability. There are one or two prospects that were relinquished by previous license holders that, because of current government policy, they cannot be relicensed. And they are projects that could tie back into existing infrastructure. At the moment at Corrib, we're operating at less than 50% capacity. We wouldn't have to do anything else with topside. It would be a subsea well. And we could produce natural gas with a much, much lower carbon intensity than the stuff that we import across the UK interconnector, like many multiples less. And my 10-year-old knows your strawberries from Wexford have a less carbon index than your strawberries from Gibraltar, right? So could we, for example, like New Zealand, who introduced that ban, who are now looking at that again and unwinding that ban, because from an energy security perspective, they realized it was a step too far. Could we look at infrastructure-led exploration around Corrib? That might be an idea. I don't suspect it'll be anytime soon. But I keep on coming back to this idea that we have this idea that one or two things will solve it. You know, the FSRU on its own is not going to solve it. Offshore wind on its own is not going to solve it. We need a multi-pronged approach.
Well, it's the interdependency of all of these. That's the difficulty, that if you don't have offshore wind, you don't have offshore wind.
As Edwina mentioned, if one of these two interconnectors go through a central point at Moffat, I know if I was sitting in the Kremlin somewhere and I really wanted, like we see what happened with the HSE hack, you know, a chap in a basement somewhere and wherever else. If you really want, I mean, it's devastating to Ireland. 6 months could be a good outcome, where we'll be shutting down industry essentially to keep residential energy supply going. What does that do to Ireland's reputation from an FDI perspective? So we've been sailing close to the wind for a long, long time, and we've been sort of relatively lucky. And as Dan says, the world has changed. And I think we just need to probably bring a more pragmatic and realistic approach to our energy policy debate. That's really all I'm trying to say.
Yes, another question, please, from the floor. Oh, it's just behind you, the mic.
Yeah, thanks. I just had to pick up on a couple of the points that were made on security of supply. there was one incident with the Kinsale Head into Cork pipeline, and the guys thought it was out of commission. It didn't actually get fractured. It wasn't a Russian submarine. It was some geezer coming out of Cork Harbour who forgot to pull a sea anchor. And gas pipelines are very vulnerable, much more vulnerable than subsea, which are buried telecoms cables and stuff like that. Gas pipelines are big and awkward and tricky to fix. That one, there was a scare for a while. I got another scare when people started talking about subsidizing the demand for nitrogen directly and indirectly, or subsidizing the demand for gas through an upgraded and maintained network and so on. Because that's what we did in the late 70s, early 80s, when the Kinsale Head field was discovered. And it was clear that the capacity in it exceeded likely domestic demand. So the government decided we would subsidize the export of fertilizer by a state company called NET, through giving them gas for less than it cost. And that was hidden in the accounts of BGE as it was at the time. And eventually, of course, it failed. And you can't make a living in this world by subsidizing exports. It's economics 101. So we need to be very careful about all this loose talk about Ireland is the Saudi Arabia wind and all this kind of stuff. It would be if you had discovered an enormous field full of hydrogen, ready to go hydrogen.
We've been hearing that Saudi Arabia analogy for a while now in terms of offshore wind, maybe hydrogen, maybe biomethane.
Yeah, well, one possibility, it looks like Saudi Arabia is going to be blessed again with solar. And there's actually some serious wind possibilities in the Middle East, in Oman in particular, and maybe a bit in Saudi Arabia. So I would be thrilled. I'm not saying I hope it happens, but I would be thrilled if Saudi Arabia turned out to be the Saudi Arabia of wind.
That was Professor Colin McCarthy from UCD.
Can I just put one quick question to the department? You mentioned the Turlock Hill pump storage station in West Wicklow. And it is, and I'm open to contradiction on this, it is the biggest battery in Ireland as of today, and it works as a battery. And if the whole system went down, it would give a few hours of power and so on. Trouble is, it's the only one, and there are various people with all sorts of schemes, most of them demanding subsidies to produce more battery possibilities in the years ahead, and perhaps they could. Is the department seriously considering pump storage opportunities elsewhere, or has ESB come along and said, look, we want to build some more Turlock Hills elsewhere?
Please do, and introduce yourself.
Professor at College Dublin. For me, it's a bit of deja vu. I was here 15 years ago at this stand talking about Spirit of Ireland. I'm not sure if you remember that.
Just hold it up to you, that's all.
Spirit of Ireland. So this was a pump storage, seawater pump storage in the west of Ireland. I was actually the leader of this project from scientific end. Was involved in putting the numbers and the finances and everything else and technical specs. So the price for a pump storage, 150 gigawatt hours, close to kilobags, was about 1 billion. So that was the power was 1 gigawatt, capacity 150 gigawatt hours. So Turlock Hill is negligible compared to that. I mean, it's nothing really. So that is something that you could actually operate country on the basis of that battery for about a week. So that's what, puts it in perspective.
We need to maybe resurrect that.
Yeah, also just I think we need to have more kind of sense of the technical limitations. I'm not here to advocate Spirit of Ireland. We worked for 4 years, we've done everything we could. We realized it's impossible to do it in Ireland for planning permission reasons. So we kind of gave up on that 10 years ago. People ask me from time to time, why did we not build it? Now it would cost massively more. The round trip efficiency for pump storage is about 85% if you use variable speed machines. So hydrogen by electrolysis, as far as I know, is about 36% to produce hydrogen. So you put 100%, you get 36% in hydrogen. So it's very expensive. It certainly it should be a part of the mix. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that my sense, since I was involved in that project, no. The answer is there was no interest from the Department of Energy, unfortunately.
That was 15 years ago,
I
so
think-
we might let Charlie come back
I think
in.
if we look at what's happened, we have Turlock Hill, as been alluded to, that's there for over 50 years, and that has about 300 megawatts of storage. And then since the start of this decade, lithium iron batteries have come along, and we're now up at just over 1 gigawatt of storage between the batteries and between Turlock Hill. And we brought out electricity storage policy framework last year by the department. And within that, we're saying we're technology neutral because there are a lot of new technologies out there. There's iron air, which can store up to 100 hours. There's one has received planning up in Donegal, whether it'll proceed or not is another thing. There's also CO2 batteries. So there's a lot of new technologies out there. But there's also, and I think it's well known, silver mines down in Tipperary, their project of common interest within the EU, and they've received some EU funding where they're looking at pumped hydro storage, something similar size to what Turlock Hill is. But I think going forward, we're going to need much more storage, and we're going to need a combination of different ones. The government is technology neutral or agnostic, and we will support where we think it's feasible and correct to do so.
Thanks so much. I'm conscious of the time, but we have two more questions there, but that we might get to very quickly. And then I'm going to ask you for your call to actions and how do we achieve all of these fantastic visions, and then we're going to wrap. So
thank you very much. My name is Kshitij and I'm from K Advisors. So just to deep down on the Tim's question about we are at the tail end of the energy in Europe, and there's no silver bullet out here. Whenever we talk about the solutions or decarbonized system, we always talk in the silos. This is a gas system. We'll talk about gas. We'll talk about biomethane. We'll talk about hydrogen. And we are ready to build the infrastructure 5 times, 6 times more than what we require because of the variable sources we have in terms of the wind and solar. Had we ever thought about, and this is a question for the entire panel, had we ever thought about the integrated system? And I'm not talking about the interconnectors. I'm actually talking about the real integrated system where you have a heat, electricity, water, transport, everything working together. Had we ever thought about it? And do we need something like NESO in Ireland to think about this? Because we all are siloed in our day jobs.
I might start on that one. So look, I think from our perspective, we've worked incredibly closely with EirGrid, and we're actually working on an MOU with EirGrid as well at the moment. But we take a lot of their electricity forecasts, and that is a fundamental impact in terms of how we plan from a gas perspective. And we're increasingly looking at, combined scenarios or common scenarios. I think SAI have been tasked as well with doing some work by DC in relation to coming up with a kind of a more integrated view. And ourselves, ESB, are involved in the working group for that. So I think, to be fair, that's starting to happen. NESO has a role as well in the UK, but I think we're already starting to think more like that in Ireland. And look, we've already mentioned about hydrogen. Basically now we have a more integrated system if hydrogen becomes a reality. because it's not just gas going into the electricity system and staying there, it's now electricity coming back out, being converted into hydrogen and being used in the gas network. So to be fair, I think an integrated system is becoming ever more a reality. And in order to operate an integrated system, there needs to be more cohesive thinking across the electricity and gas utilities.
Barbara, would you like to respond on that?
I was just thinking that I think the last question, the person that asked the question is very correct. We need to be more integrated. When people say that hydrogen is not efficient, the intermittency of renewable electricity from windmills is very inefficient. And the electricity grids, you sometimes need to build double or 3 times the capacity of the cables to meet peak demand. And I just quickly looked up the internet, it was 2.8 billion euros in Germany last year alone because of the intermittency of the renewable electricity. So we really do need to look at integrated supply chains. There was a study done by the German gas, DVGW, and it looked at the supply chain from a windmill to a battery, an EV, a car, versus hydrogen, not much difference. When you look at intermittency and lost renewable electricity with you know, when the wind is too strong or when there isn't wind. So we really have to have that open mind. And what I wanted to say before, thanks Katrina, was 50% of end use cannot be electricity. So we're forced to look at what do we do to decarbonize gases and liquids. It cannot be electrons and it has to be a molecule. And that's hydrogen or methane. And for that, look up the IRENA World Energy Transition Outlook reports, especially the first one. So we should always bear that in mind. It can't be all electricity, and we are forced to look at decarbonising gases and liquids.
I would just like to say to the gentleman, I believe it has been historically siloed, and I think it has to be integrated. For one, the biggest issue this country is facing is housing. Single biggest issue we have is a housing crisis. And we won't fix housing unless we fix energy, grid, and water. And so the integration requirement is actually wider than just energy. There's an infrastructure integration requirement in Ireland that has been lacking, and we have no chance at all of fixing the housing situation unless we start integrating on an infrastructure-wide basis.
Can I add on that?
Can I just, I'm really conscious of the time, and I think we can continue this discussion at the reception afterwards. So let's just pause that thought. I want to hear one last question from the floor, please.
Sorry, thank you. And Andrew Hagan, Element 2. We've been going in hydrogen now for over 5 years, and I think our biggest success factor or shouting point is we haven't died, which is a major achievement in the hydrogen industry. But we've been working with the National Gas Aspect and doing all the testing over the last 3 years. I've got about 20 questions, but I spent 10 years in Switzerland before coming here, and I'm conscious of the time as well, getting nervous. But a couple of quick points. So Katie, you mentioned, I mean, someone mentioned competition between Scotland and Ireland. You did mention the learnings. For us, after the last 5 years, there's a lot of key learnings of what not to do. I think the success stories have a lot of negative factors that need to be shared, particularly Aberdeen as well. Great success, but a lot of things that could be avoided if you start from the beginning and say, don't do this. I would say, I mean, people just touched on a lot of the good points that, I mean, we're coming back to my big question about storage. And Barbara, you were there at the conference Flame in Amsterdam as well. And when they put the graph up that showed the energy consumption increase just from data centers using AI alone, that dwarfs the German national consumption of electricity in 1 year, where that's going to get to. And if you look back at Sir Crystal Ellen Smith's report for the Royal Society 2 years ago, the amount of energy storage to make the energy transition happen, we're completely underestimating it. I mean, we would need over 1,000 times the hydro pump storage that we've got at the moment. We would need 60 to 100 terawatt hours just for the UK demand of hydrogen storage alone. You combine that with the curtailed wind every year in Ireland, I think 2023 was 1 terawatt hour, UK about 7 times that. So that gas storage, Edwina, you touched on it, we don't have gas storage here in Ireland. I think we're going to need that. I think to meet the demand, and Ireland has 1 or 2 data centers as well. It's a reasonable part of the economy. To meet that demand, to make the energy transition work, we're going to need that energy storage. Are there plans to develop that is my key question.
I might start. I think 100% when we get to like hydrogen, you need storage 100%. And I think look, what we've seen at a European level is it's salt caverns are probably your best storage solution in the short term. We only have one in Ireland, which is the Island McGee facility in Northern Ireland. I think there's also works ongoing as well around proving, gas fields, historic gas fields as well. And I'm not an engineer, but that's slightly behind salt caverns. But I think we will need all of the potential storage solutions. I know you looked at it as well in Carib at one point as well. And I think so I think you're right. I think we made an estimate that we probably need about 10 terawatt hours of storage in the country, which is massive. And look, I think that's, we were talking about, you said earlier on, it's 10 years away in terms of I said earlier on in terms of it's 10 years away in terms of scale. We need to start thinking about some of that now so that we're in a good position in 10 or 15 years when it's actually required. It won't be needed at that scale in the short term, but we need to start working on it now.
Now, I think we could safely say we could stay here all night talking about this because it's so complex. There's so many different things. But I'd like to just sum up maybe with a very short 1 minute. What's your call to action for everybody in the room and watching at home? What would you like people to take away with them? Is it, call your TD and tell them that you want to support biomethane and hydrogen? Or is it tell your children to go to do engineering in school? What is it that you want to leave as the parting message?
I think my call to action is when you hear the myriad of interdependencies across the conversation that we've had, it's probably for people to work collectively. And we were talking earlier on about almost a coalition of the willing, but that's kind of what we need. So we all need to be kind of working to the same tune, understand the scale of the ambition that we're trying to achieve and work together to achieve it.
Brilliant. Tom?
Yeah, I think we have a great wee country here with a great economy and great potential. That to service the potential for my kids, your kids, our grandkids, we're going to need energy. And we have real potential there, whether it's offshore wind or biomethane, as I mentioned earlier. I think what we need to do, though, is we're great in this country at setting targets. Fantastic. We're the best target setters in the world. But if you're sitting there and you're marking your scorecard for actual execution and delivery, there's a big gap there, a big gap. Now, there's no one fix for that. But that would be my call to action, is for the powers that be, whoever they might be, and we're all part of the solution here.
You're empowered to be yourself.
Oh, yeah. But as Edwina says, we all need to work collectively. That would be my macro desire would be is trying to focus, laser focus on actual execution and delivery.
Deploy.
Yeah, that's what it's all about now, because we're melodramatic. People are talking about the temperatures in Spain. People are voting from an FTI perspective. A lot of companies are voting with their feet now. They're deploying capital in other countries, and so we need to. Yeah, there's a bit of an emergency here.
Yeah.
So we need to get after it, and it'll help us solve other problems in terms of housing and other things. So that's my call.
Katie, what's your call to action for all?
I just combine both of theirs. So on Edwina, yeah, of course, collaboration, and that's what, that's why we're here in Scotland representing as another excellent wee country right next door to you. I'm not going to say we've solved lots of delivery problems, but there are some things which we have done around planning, consenting, and this this sort of
you've been getting an all 9 out of 10 there now, Katie.
That we've been trying. So I mean, I think that's the thing. Okay. What can we learn from each other? What can we learn also from the likes of the experience which Andrew's company has for being in that sector? So,
Charlie.
Yeah, I think we all do need to work together. I think we're all heading in the same direction, and we all have the same desire to reach there. I think sometimes we may be a little bit hard on ourselves. The Turlough Hill is a good example. Turlough Hill was built 50 years ago. We've never built any storage since. And then since the turn of the decade, we've put in about 2 or 3 times the amount of storage. Tom said he worked on the Arklow Bank 25 years ago when the first wind turbine was put in the Irish Sea. I know there's been a long pause in between, but at least now there are a number of projects in planning there. We're probably not moving as quick as we'd like to move, but I think we are moving, and I think if we're all working together, working in the same direction, and trying and get the best out of each other.
Brilliant. Barbara? Oh, you're on mute there. We want to hear these words of wisdom.
Well, the words of wisdom, you come from the wee countries. I'm in a store of a country. Germany is so big. The ask by on the Ready for H2 project is allow all solutions and use existing infrastructure for speed of delivery of green gases, but also cheaper for the end user. And it can be done safely. But also importantly, allow all the different parts of the supply chain to get ready at the same time. There's a lot of effort into the cross-border transmission network. But again, 10 times the number of pipelines is all national, but it deserves the same attention. And the DSO businesses need financial certainty. They don't know what the tariffs are. They don't know what the rules are for the regulated assets. And they also, with the new decarbonised gas package, there's a lot of uncertainties with horizontal unbundling, the planning requirements, having to predict to 2030 what's going to happen with your grid. It's almost impossible. So a lot of uncertainty, but they want to stay in business and they want to be part of the solution.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. Well, I think it's fair to say there's plenty of work to be doing, and it's clear that it's a shared national mission in terms of decarbonising the economy and the society, and averting the worst of climate crisis, and also keeping this successful wee country that we have on the road. And how to reconcile all of that at the same time is the work that's going to keep you and everybody else here busy for the next coming decades. So thank you to everybody who joined on Zoom. Thank you to Barbara calling in from Germany. Thank you to all in attendance for your attention and your engagement. Please join us for a reception downstairs, and no doubt we will have these conversations again into the future. So slán go bhfuil agus gur magat.
And you can have a wee drink for me.